Thank you all so much for joining tonight. My name is Lindsay. I am the founder and CEO of LogicPrep. And I want to start by thanking Nidhi Gomez for helping to organize tonight's discussion and for giving me such a warm welcome to Miami, both when I'm in town and virtually, of course, as I am tonight, joining you from freezing New York City. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to serve as a resource to all of you and to get to learn about your children. So thank you. So to begin, some of you may be wondering why on earth you should listen to me tonight. So let me begin by telling you a bit about who I am and about LogicPrep. So personally, my background is in writing and literature. I was an English major at Harvard, and my deep interest in storytelling has informed my approach to advising students, which I've been doing for the last 13 years. I now help students applying to college tell their stories through the classes they take, the extracurriculars that they pursue, and the essays that they write. My expertise with students is both local and global, in person and online. We're headquartered in New York, where I am now. We also have an office in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and we work with students around the country and around the globe, and certainly in Miami as well. I lead a team of college advisors who work with students virtually. All of them are former admissions officers from top schools such as Stanford, Harvard, Duke, Babson, UVA, Georgetown. And together they bring more than 30 years of experience evaluating nearly 50,000 applications and deep insight into the higher education landscape. So tonight I'm going to be sharing some of our team's insights and tips and hopefully take some of the stress out of the college application process and to help you navigate the road ahead. So I'll speak for about a half hour and then we'll break into Q&A. So please put any questions you have as I'm talking into the chat box and I will get to them at the end. I also want to thank many of you submitted really thoughtful questions in advance. Some of them are incorporated into the presentation. Others I will address at the very end. And if they're more individual, I'll be in touch personally so that we can have a more in-depth discussion about the process as it pertains to you and your family specifically. So I've organized tonight's discussion according to what I think of as the 3 pillars of the application process: the academic record, standardized testing, and the personal narrative. And I think right off the bat, it's important to say that I recognize many of you may be wondering if and how COVID has impacted these pillars. And in short, what I want to say tonight, and this may surprise you, is that from our perspective, actually not all that much has changed. I certainly don't mean to minimize the disruptiveness or in some cases the disappointment or inconvenience associated with recent developments. But fundamentally, when it comes to applying to college, things do remain the same. Colleges continue to seek out students who demonstrate creativity, compassion, initiative, and impact. And while the avenues for expressing that may be a little bit more limited now, there's actually tremendous opportunity to show ingenuity and grit in all of these forms: the transcript, standardized testing, and certainly the more creative personal narrative piece. So we're going to get to each of those individually now. Okay, so let's start with the academic record or curriculum and grades. And I want to begin by explaining that when college admissions officers are evaluating students' applications, they're doing so on a regional basis. So the individual that will read your application is going to be trained specifically in South Florida high schools. So what does that mean? It means that they know your school and they're going to be looking at how you specifically navigate the curriculum. And this is really important sort of thematically speaking, because it's just a really powerful example of how much context matters. Transcripts, when they're submitted to universities, are sent along with what's called a secondary school report, which provides an overview of the high school and the course options that are available. And I bring this up because so often I'm asked by families, is an AP curriculum better? Is an IB curriculum better? Does it really matter? And the answer is no. What actually matters is to make sure that you're challenging yourself in your areas of strength and maintaining your grades to the best of your ability. And so in thinking sort of about that and reflecting further on the importance of context, I also want to point out that your transcript in itself is a narrative and that grades matter from day one of high school, but the trajectory of those grades matters as well. So you really want to try to show an upward trend if you can. Of course, if we start strong and maintain, that's the best thing. But it's much harder to explain kind of a decline in grades, especially as the rigor of the coursework increases. So it's all about really designing a sufficiently challenging and engaging course load and maintaining grades. Okay, so now on to our second pillar, everyone's favorite, the standardized testing piece of things, the SAT or the ACT. Let's actually start there because those are like the big ones. There are a bunch of tests that you've probably heard called out before, but the SAT and ACT are really like the big and important ones. One fallacy that I sort of want to dispel is that students should be taking both the SAT and the ACT. And I am a firm believer that that is not the case. Colleges equally value the SAT and the ACT. They're both equally valid and viable alternatives. So the key is to identify, and early on, which test is going to be the best display of your potential, because otherwise you're going to be spending a lot of time sort of split between pursuing two parallel paths when it's really a dilution of energy and effort. So my recommendation strongly would be to begin the standardized testing kind of evaluation process by taking two full-length diagnostics, one in the SAT and one in the ACT. And this will allow you to really ascertain which test feels like the best display of your potential and which is most comfortable. So ideally, I would suggest that this diagnostic process happen the second semester of sophomore year so that you can ideally wrap up your testing by the end of junior year and focus your energy that next summer into applications and essays and more of the nuts and bolts of the application process. When it comes to these tests, it really is a marathon and not a sprint, and it can take many months to kind of maximize your outcomes. So starting early is ideal. And that's not to say that it's too late for first semester juniors by any means, but to the extent that you're able to plan ahead, the end of sophomore year is really the ideal time to be starting to think about these tests. The other thing I want to point out in planning your timeline, which will likely culminate in testing throughout junior year, is that many students actually take the SAT or the ACT multiple times. First test day jitters are pretty common. Sometimes it just feels, more comfortable the second or third time. And I would say that a one and done kind of experience is uncommon, but something to be celebrated. 4 times is pretty unfortunate. 2 or 3 is fairly normal. And one of the reasons that can actually be to students' benefit is that some schools do what's called super scoring. So they take the best score from one section from one test day and the best score from another section from another test day. So let's say math was great in May and English was excellent in June, and they combine them together to create a new score. So that's really just something to be cognizant of. Not every college subscribes to this policy, but it is an option at many schools. And that's actually a great transition, I think, to talk about sort of the variable nature of standardized testing, particularly in this environment in terms of like requirements and how schools think about testing. As you may be aware and kind of following the news of college admissions right now, nearly every school, not every, but many, have made the decision out of necessity to go test optional for this admission cycle. When the pandemic hit, the SAT and the ACT were canceled almost universally, and students were largely not able to take the tests. So in response to that, colleges, many of them, implemented what are called test optional policies, meaning if students submit scores, they'll be evaluated. If they choose not to submit scores, they will not be considered as part of the application, and that will not be to the student's detriment. I want to point out 2 really important things about this. One, these test optional accommodations at the majority of schools are intended to be kind of an adaptation to this pretty chaotic admissions environment that is this cycle. And we'll see in that this cycle also is functioning as quite a meaningful experiment for colleges moving forward about how they want to think about standardized testing. But this is temporary for the majority of schools. Likewise, test optional does not mean that test scores are not going to be evaluated. Test scores can still be quite valuable and quite additive, even in a test optional context. There are a very small handful of schools that are flirting with the possibility of going test blind. The UC system is perhaps the most known example of this that's implemented a test blind policy. And that's an important distinction. That means that they're not considering test scores. But that's also not at all the norm. And for many, many students, test scores can be additive. But it's a matter of ascertaining, do I fall into that camp? And that is why diagnostic testing is so important. So you can figure out which test is for you and set goals and decide whether that's going to be a plus for the application. Likewise, the SAT subject tests are something that you may have heard about, may have been familiar with. They're certainly de-emphasized for this admission cycle, given the chaos around test dates. But basically, they're hour-long exams in the subjects of your choice. So there are exams in subjects like biology and US history and literature, and they're really meant to show mastery and prowess. They're only required or even recommended at the very most selective schools. But again, they can be potentially additive if students feel that they could perform well on them with the appropriate amount of studying and not at the detriment of their coursework, for example, because of course, grades are going to be an important component of this. So just really putting SAT subject tests on the radar as part of the whole testing scheme, but certainly secondary to the SAT or ACT. Okay. Now we're going to move on to my favorite part, the personal narrative. I think this part is a lot more fun than the rest because it's really the venue for the most creativity. And I also think the place where students have the most control. The personal narrative is basically everything that gets submitted to colleges that makes the student unique and speaks to who they really are. So it encompasses the activities, the leadership endeavors, and the essays that really comprise your specific story. So as I mentioned, our team of college advisors, they're all former admissions officers. So they're intimately familiar with what it means to evaluate a transcript or how to look at the SAT or the ACT in context and what that really means. But I also feel like where they're so tremendously additive is in that how deeply attuned they are to the importance of narrative and helping students actually craft that narrative and really tapping into what's interesting and what engages the students, what makes them like lean in a little bit and sparks their curiosity so that they, over the course of their high school experience, can craft a really genuine and compelling resume and story. So many families, are wondering what students can be doing now, particularly during our time largely at home, to get ahead in this application process and to work on this narrative, which is much harder to do when schools are largely closed and students aren't gathering for after-school club meetings in the way that they once were. But there's actually quite a bit that students can do now to take advantage of the opportunity that kind of fall into these different categories. I think that now is actually a really wonderful time to show initiative and impact in even more kind of creative and novel ways. Because at the end of the day, it's not about checking boxes on the applications. When colleges talk about valuing leadership, they don't mean that the student has to be the president of the student council. It means that they have to show commitment and drive and the ability to help students, partner and collaborate together. And that can look different. It doesn't have to be so formal, for example. So I think now is really an excellent opportunity to really think about how to display that in creative and different ways. So we have a lot of students who are actually doing online coursework in academic areas that are just interesting to them, that maybe their high schools don't cover. So many universities have made their material available for free through online resources such as edX and Coursera. MIT and Yale have open courseware. And it's really an awesome opportunity to just like sign up and see what's out there. I have a student who's working on a novel, another one who just downloaded like the final draft software and said, you know what, I used to act during the school year. That's not really happening for me right now. I'm going to work on writing a screenplay. And then, of course, you know, there are just so many problems in our world to solve right now, which I think creates a really interesting platform for innovation when it comes to social impact. So, you know, our advisors and I really encourage students to think through how they can support their community, and whether that means continuing service work they've already engaged in school, or even starting a new project in response to what's going on. So, for example, we have one student that's using the skills she developed as a costume designer for her school's play to make masks. And we had another student in the spring who applied, you know, his interest in robotics to 3D printing face shields for a local hospital. So there's no one path to starting to develop this narrative. But now, no matter how young you are, whether you're a freshman or getting older, it's definitely the time to start thinking through where to make an impact. So the essays really feel like a natural extension of this notion of the personal narrative as well, because they're really the embodiment of it. They're the place where everything comes together and you're able to describe on the page kind of who you are and what you're going to bring to a school. Increasingly, colleges are de-emphasizing interviews in the application process. For the most part, they're only offered on a space available basis, largely with alumni rather than on campus. So the essays, I would say, have more emphasis and more importance in that respect, because it's really the place to tell your story in your own words. So let me start, I guess, by giving you an overview of what the essays actually are, what they entail. There are basically two main platforms that students and high schools engage with during the application process to actually facilitate the submission of applications. And those are called the Common Application and the Coalition Application. So sort of like the SAT and the ACT, that there are two alternatives. The Coalition and the Common App are like the competing platforms. And both of those application platforms have a large question. When I say large, it's actually only 650 words. So it's not that long, but it's meaty in terms of content. And that's like what everyone refers to as the college essay. It's the main essay. There are a number of prompts that students can answer, but the actual question that's being answered, I think, matters a lot less than the tone, the voice, what it is that the student wants to actually convey. And something we say around our office a lot is that that main essay is your chance to get invited to the party. It's sort of a statement of like who you are and what you're going to contribute, and to share that energy that's going to score you an invitation. So that's the main essay. And then there are a number of other essays that are submitted alongside it, which are referred to as supplements. So those are school-specific essays, and they tend to be a little bit shorter in length and sometimes more playful. So they're the kinds of questions that are like, what's your favorite word and why? If you had a free afternoon to spend, like, what would you do? Another category of supplemental questions is what I call the why essays as well. A lot of colleges will ask you, why do you want to go here? And that's actually a huge opportunity to demonstrate fit and match and really show that you've done your research. So while our writing coaches help students develop, I would say, like an overarching template to structure their response to the why essays, we're quite adamant that students need to really invest in doing the research to ascertain and then effectively convey why they actually want to go to those schools. Like, what classes would they take? What professors would they study with? Which clubs would they join? Because one of the things that colleges are actually evaluating when they're looking at students' applications is how likely students are to go there and actually attend the school if they're offered admission. Many schools all schools, frankly, are sensitive to this notion of yield. And so you really want to effectively convey why you feel you would be a good match. So stepping back for a bit, I want to share kind of some general wisdom on the essay. I think that it has to be said, there's no magic formula, there's no tips and tricks. It's really just about presenting a compelling and insightful version of yourself and showing self-reflection. And I would say forward momentum, but also not presenting a fixed version of the self. I think that colleges also recognize that teenagers are applying who will likely change their minds and discover new passions and engage in what is on campus. And I think it's important, no matter what age you are in high school and where you are kind of in this trajectory, to just have an awareness of the kinds of things that colleges are going to ask for or really look for in the essays, because I think that helps steer some of the thinking, certainly around extracurricular activities, leadership, but also the kind of self-reflection that doesn't just come like in an instant like that. It's like just on the spot, oh, this is what I'm going to write about. Sometimes essays, in my experience, come out of reflection or like the kernel of an idea that emerges when you're not totally expecting it or totally even focused on this particular process. So I tell all of our students, starting like as early as sophomore year, to just keep a journal and jot down ideas, insights that just seem interesting one way or another. It doesn't have to be a fully formed idea, but something that just maybe sparks their interest and seems like potentially the kernel of something bigger. Okay, so let's get to the nuts and bolts of all of this. I know I've covered quite a bit, and I want to sort of put this in a timeline to acclimate you all in time and space. And I will be circulating after tonight's discussion an actual timeline document, so you have this as a reference. It's actually a bit more detailed than what's here as well. But I want to kind of cover with you, at least thematically, what you all should be thinking about year by year. So freshman year, really the time to be thinking about challenging coursework, doing well in your classes, developing relationships with teachers, fostering study skills, and setting the foundation for the kind of academic performance and engagement as part of the school community that will serve you throughout the rest of high school. It's also a time to start trying different extracurricular activities so that you can potentially focus down the road. As you can probably surmise, I'm a big believer in quality versus quantity of activities. It's not about just like collecting activities. It's really about focusing and channeling your interests, but that doesn't happen overnight. And that's why I really encourage freshmen to get involved in a lot of things and see what's interesting. Sophomore year is when things ramp up a bit academically. It's often the time that students will take their first AP class, for example. It's the time to start thinking about that diagnostic SAT and ACT testing, as we talked about, and to begin, I think, really researching and potentially even visiting colleges in earnest. One of the things that I think has been like one of the silver linings, so to speak, of college campuses not being open for visitors at the moment is that they've created much stronger and better representative virtual resources. And it's such like a low cost, low investment way for students to just like learn about schools. You don't have to hop on a plane or get in a car. You can just sign in, take a virtual tour. And that's good really for two reasons. One, it gives you a sense of, is this a place where I could see myself? Do I even like this category of school? And which is the first step toward building a list and potentially building a list of schools to actually visit once you have more insight into what's interesting. And the second piece is that many colleges track what's called demonstrated interest. So this is a phrase you may kind of hear in your research. And demonstrated interest basically means how effectively has a student conveyed their interest in attending a school. It's one of the things that an effective why essay does. It says, this is why I see myself as a good match for you. And colleges value demonstrated interest. It is, or many colleges do, and it's kind of a marker and an important piece of criteria. So it's an easy way to just get on their mailing list. Colleges are tracking that, and they're tracking attendance at these sessions. Then for any of you here who are juniors, I think you probably know this well, junior year is like the year. So that's why we talk a lot about getting started early and trying to be as thoughtful about mapping out the timeline. It's the year where most of the standardized testing happens, ideally where you're really kind of enhancing your focus in extracurricular activities, potentially taking on some leadership, and cultivating relationships with teachers who will ideally write letters of recommendation on your behalf. So when it comes time to apply to college, students will need to ask 2 teachers for letters of recommendation, and those are typically junior year and occasionally senior year teachers. And finally, senior year, like it just happens, it sneaks up on all of us, and that is application time. So there are 2 primary rounds of deadlines. The early deadlines in November, around November 1 typically, and the regular deadlines, which we're just approaching, around January 1. And there are quite a few nuances in terms of the various application plans, early decision versus early action, whether something is binding or not binding, and we can get into that certainly more in our Q&A. But the 2 primary kind of big dates to note are November 1 and January 1. And I would advise that students really begin working on their applications and essays in the summer, early summer, ideally preceding senior year, to allow for sufficient time to develop the applications and essays and not sacrifice the focus that's needed on senior year coursework. Okay, so that brings us to the end here. And I just want to point out that in the background, you'll see a number of logos representing actually just a handful of schools where our students have matriculated. We have a network of over 1,000 alumni spread out all over the country, most of whom are in college or recent grads. And I just want to say that I think that they're really excited always to share their experiences and offer a much more candid and personal take than any official tour will ever give, whether you're intending to visit schools on campus or engage with them online. So I just want to say to feel free to reach out to me anytime if you'd like to connect with a LogicPrep alum at any of these schools or any others. We have students at practically all the schools out there. I love making these introductions, and it's really fun to kind of connect the community of students going through the process and those that have matriculated. So I realize that this is all quite a bit of info, as I said, and I am going to be circulating a timeline as a follow-up. I also want to say that I would be happy to meet any of you individually to discuss your child's plans. I recognize that this is a very kind of individual process, and there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of specificity to it. And that's why I do think that many of these conversations are best had one-on-one. But with all that said, I would love to go on to the questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to chat them over in the box. Anything? Let's see, I'm just taking a look at some of the questions that were submitted in advance of tonight's discussion. I want to see kind of who's here and see if I can get to all of them that were submitted from attendees. So okay. How important are extracurricular activities? And how can summers help with that? I think that is an awesome question. So I would say that extracurricular activities are important because they're part of that kind of third pillar, the narrative piece. So they don't replace test scores or transcript, but they're certainly an enhancement to that and an opportunity to make your application and your story and your personality come alive. So I think that the key with extracurricular activities is to genuinely choose things that are interesting to you and commit and show. The word we use around our office a ton is impact. So one of our admissions advisors used to work at Stanford, and she said that was just like the word, it was the buzzword that was thrown. Oh. Hi, I'm sorry, my computer just did something a little bit nutty. But one of at Stanford, impact is like the word that's thrown around. So when you're actually thinking about extracurriculars, this advisor had mentioned to students, like, think about how you can quantify what you're doing. So if you're doing like a community service project, for example, like, can you attach numbers to the amount of money raised or the number of students helped? All of that is super important to think about around extracurriculars. And summers, to Needy's point and question, are a great opportunity to go deeper because you have more time. So like summers are an awesome opportunity to have an internship or a job. I think that's really, really powerful to do more in-depth volunteering or to take a college course and further your academics in some way. Excellent. And Mauro, you just asked how important service hours are. That is very much linked with this whole discussion. And I would say to that community service is very important. The number of hours as sort of a concrete thing is less of an emphasis. So I know in many high schools, there are community service hour requirements, and that's actually not part of the college application or college admissions process. Students will be asked on the activities section of the application to report how many hours that they're spending on sports or service or academics, but there's absolutely no minimum threshold. And that's not really the key to it or the emphasis. It's really about what are they doing? Like, what is the quality of the experience rather than the number of hours, if that makes sense. There's no bar to hit necessarily. And this is awesome. And another great question about extracurricular activities. This is all part of like the larger discussion here. And this is where it gets much more personal and I think much more interesting. So do extracurricular activities have to be related to what you want to study and pursue in college? And the answer is no. Like, I think extracurricular activities are a great opportunity to start to maybe explore what you could want to study in college, because it's a great way to like branch out and see what's interesting. But colleges are not particularly looking for that. It's not a have to by any means. And I actually think that, for example, we have many engineering students or engineering applicants, I should say, students applying for undergraduate degrees in engineering or business, even, for example, who also just really like art and do art or theater as well. And I actually think that makes just for a much more dynamic application and a much more dynamic applicant. So I would really encourage students to do what is interesting, not what feels directed to any particular major, with the caveat that if you are going to apply to a particular program, for example, like engineering or business or medicine, to have some exposure to some extracurriculars in those venues. Because I think it's much easier to create a compelling case about why you want to study business if you've taken a business class or worked versus not having had any exposure at all. Any other questions? I'm going to cover one actually that was submitted that I think is relevant, because my understanding is that you guys are all coming from different high schools. So I want to get to this. One of the parents asked to know if private colleges, particularly the most selective ones, rank top magnet public high schools more preferably than top private high schools. And I think this is important to really talk about, because I think sometimes there's like a myth that colleges prefer one high school to another, or they have better, I don't know, that there's like a link that where you go to high school will be determining what your admissions chances are at particular colleges. And I really want to de-emphasize this. I think it's really about taking the most rigorous course load available and excelling within the context of whatever high school you're in. That's sort of assuming that if we're thinking about different high school options, these schools are all understood to be about equally challenging, equally rigorous, well-respected. The distinction between public, private, magnet is not all that meaningful. It's really about excelling within the context of your school. Okay, I'm just going back to the chat. Awesome. How many essays in average have to be submitted to a college? Okay, let's see. So essays, a lot. It really varies school by school. So as I was talking about, there's like that one main one that goes everywhere. And then typically schools will ask for, I would say 2 supplemental essays each. I think 2 on average. Maybe one about why the student wants to attend there, and another that's a little bit more creative in nature. And typically, just to give a little bit of context about workload, students will apply to anywhere between 10 and 12 schools. That's kind of the number that we advise. And the reason for that is that we really want to help students craft very balanced lists, with some schools that are more aspirational, what we might call a reach school, some schools that are more comfortable, our targets, and then schools that are going to be more likely. So a well-balanced list could very likely and is almost usually around 12 schools and figure about 2 essays per application. So this is the reason why we really encourage our seniors to get started in the summer preceding senior year. Great. Anything else? Okay. So I do have a couple more questions here, but I think they're a bit more individual. So I will follow up individually if you send something in that is more specific to you. And I will let you all go for the evening. Thank you so much for joining me. It was great to meet you all, and I look forward to being in touch. So.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you all for joining. Take care.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Great. Appreciate it.
Of course. See you.